I thought I was getting the deal of a lifetime when I landed a night shift job at Morrison's Gas and Go in Coldwater Junction, Alaska. $35 an hour to work at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. It seemed too good to be true. Turns out it was. My name's Tommy Rivera, and I was 24, broke, and looking for adventure when I dropped out of Arizona State after my junior year. While my friends were grinding through unpaid internships and living with their parents, I wanted something different. Alaska represented everything my suburban Phoenix life wasn't: wild, remote, and potentially profitable. I'd found the job listing on a sketchy employment website. Night shift gas station attendant needed. Remote location, $35 per hour. Room and board provided. Must be reliable and able to follow instructions precisely. The pay was more than most college graduates made, and I figured a summer in Alaska would be an adventure worth talking about for the rest of my life. The drive to Coldwater Junction took me 14 hours from Anchorage through increasingly desolate terrain until I was surrounded by nothing but dense forest and mountains. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of Morrison's Gas and Go, a small motel, and maybe a dozen houses scattered along a 2-mile stretch of the Alaska Highway. Morrison's Gas and Go sat at the junction of the main highway and a logging road, surrounded by towering spruce and pine trees that blocked out most of the sky. The building was newer than I'd expected, a standard convenience store design with large windows, bright exterior lighting, and 4 gas pumps under a covered canopy. Frank Morrison met me at the station on a grey June afternoon. He was maybe 60, with weathered hands and the kind of permanent squint that came from decades of Alaska winters. His handshake was firm, but I noticed he kept glancing toward the forest, like he was expecting something to emerge from between the trees. "Tommy Rivera?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. Ready to start whenever you need me." Frank studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Good. Come inside. Let's get you oriented." The interior looked like any other convenience store. Rows of snacks and drinks, a coffee station, lottery tickets behind the counter, and a register system that had seen better days. But I noticed a few things that seemed odd for such a remote location. Industrial-grade locks on all the doors, emergency supplies stocked in unusual quantities, and exterior lighting that was brighter than most shopping centers. "Tommy, this isn't like working at a 7-Eleven in Phoenix," Frank said as we walked through the store. "We're 200 miles from Anchorage, 50 miles from the nearest neighbor, and completely on our own from 10 o'clock at night until 6 o'clock in the morning. I can handle isolated work. It's not just the isolation. This place has particular requirements for night shift employees." Frank pulled a laminated sheet from behind the counter and handed it to me. "These are the rules. You follow them exactly, no exceptions, no improvisation." I looked at the yellowed paper with 12 rules printed in faded ink. Morrison's Gas and Go. Night shift rules. Never go outside between 11 and 5 without the emergency flare gun. If you hear scratching on the roof, turn on all exterior lights immediately. Don't sell gas to anyone driving a vehicle older than 1995. Keep the coffee fresh. Brew new pots every 2 hours during night shift. If a customer asks for directions to the old mining road, say it doesn't exist. Never turn off the radio. Keep it on static between stations if nothing's playing. Stock the walk-in freezer before 10 o'clock. Never enter it during night hours. If you see lights in the forest, close all blinds and wait inside. Don't serve customers who pay only in pre-1980 coins. Keep spare batteries for all flashlights and always carry one. If the power goes out, use only the backup generator, never the secondary power box. Trust regular customers, but verify everyone else's ID carefully. These seem specific, I said, reading through the list again. They are. Every one of these rules exists because someone learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow them. Frank's expression was serious. Tommy, I need you to understand something. This job pays $35 an hour because it's not easy money. You'll earn every penny. What kind of problems are we talking about? Frank looked toward the windows where the afternoon light was starting to fade. The kind that end careers. And sometimes more than careers. He showed me around the rest of the facility. The walk-in freezer stocked with frozen foods and drinks, the storage room with emergency supplies, and the small apartment behind the store where I'd be living. The apartment was basic but comfortable, with a bedroom, kitchenette, and sitting area. You'll work 10 to 6, 7 days a week, with 1 day off per month when I can cover the shift myself, Frank explained. Your day off has to be scheduled in advance, and you can't leave the property during your shift for any reason. What about emergencies? Frank opened a cabinet behind the counter and showed me a collection of equipment that seemed excessive for a gas station. Emergency flares, high-powered flashlights, a first aid kit that looked like it belonged in an ambulance, and what appeared to be a flare gun. These handle most emergencies. For anything else, you call me on the landline. Cell service is spotty out here. He handed me the keys to the station. Your first shift starts tonight. I'll be here until 10 to make sure you're comfortable with everything. As evening approached, I noticed the forest around the station seemed to grow darker and more oppressive. The trees formed a solid wall of black that felt like it was pressing closer to the building. Frank, what's with all the bright exterior lighting? Helps with security and other things. He checked his watch. Almost time for the night shift. You ready? I nodded, though I was starting to have second thoughts about the whole arrangement. Remember, Tommy, follow the rules exactly. Don't try to be creative. Don't try to improve on them. Don't ignore them because they seem silly. People who work here successfully are people who understand that some places have different requirements than others. At 10 o'clock sharp, Frank gathered his things and headed for the door. You'll do fine, he said. Just remember the rules and call me if anything seems unusual. After he left, I settled behind the counter with the rule sheet and tried to understand what I'd gotten myself into. The building felt different at night, larger somehow, with shadows in corners that hadn't been there during the day. Around 11:30, I heard the first sound that made me understand why Frank's rules were so specific. Scratching. It came from directly above my head, like something with claws was testing the strength of the roof tiles. The sound moved slowly across the ceiling, deliberate and purposeful. Rule number 2. If you hear scratching on the roof, turn on all exterior lights immediately. I flipped every switch I could find, flooding the gas pumps and surrounding area with brilliant white light. The scratching stopped immediately. Through the windows, I thought I saw something large moving at the edge of the forest, just beyond the range of the lights. But when I looked directly at the movement, there was nothing there except darkness between the trees. I spent the rest of my first night behind the counter, jumping at every sound and watching the forest for signs of movement. When Frank arrived at 6 o'clock, I was exhausted, but proud that I'd made it through without incident. "How was it?" he asked. "Quiet. I heard some scratching on the roof around 11:30, but I turned on all the exterior lights and it stopped." Frank nodded approvingly. "Good. That's exactly what you're supposed to do." What was making the noise? Frank looked toward the forest, then back at me. "Things that don't like bright lights. You'll learn to recognize the different sounds, and you'll learn which rules handle which situations." As I headed to my apartment to sleep, I realized my first night at Morrison's Gas and Go had been a test, and somehow I'd passed. But I had the feeling the tests were just beginning. My first week at Morrison's Gas and Go taught me that Frank's rules weren't arbitrary guidelines. They were survival instructions disguised as employee policies. During the day, the place felt normal enough. Truckers stopped for fuel and coffee, construction workers grabbed lunch, and the occasional tourist asked for directions to Anchorage. Frank handled the day shift with the easy competence of someone who'd been running the place for decades. But at night, the station transformed into something else entirely. On my second night, I learned about rule number 4 the hard way. I'd been busy restocking shelves and forgot to brew fresh coffee at 2 o'clock like I was supposed to. Around 2:30, Bob Wallace, a trucker who'd been driving this route for 15 years, stopped for his regular coffee and fuel. "This coffee tastes like it's been sitting for hours," he complained, pouring out his cup. "Sorry, I'll make a fresh pot." Bob looked at me seriously. "Son, you need to follow Frank's rules exactly. I mean exactly. That's not a suggestion. It's a requirement for working here safely." "It's just coffee." "No, it's not. Nothing here is just anything." Bob glanced toward the windows, where the forest pressed against the circle of light from our exterior floods. "You make fresh coffee every 2 hours because the regular customers expect it. And when the regular customers are happy, other things leave you alone." I made fresh coffee immediately and served Bob a new cup. He tasted it, nodded approval, and paid for his fuel. "Follow the rules, Tommy. All of them, all the time. Frank hired you because he thinks you can handle this job, but it only works if you do exactly what you're told." On my third night, I encountered rule number 3 directly. Around midnight, a pickup truck pulled up to the pumps, an older Ford that looked like it had been restored with care. The driver was maybe 40, wearing clean clothes and carrying a valid credit card. But when I looked at his truck more carefully, I noticed the registration sticker showed 1992. Rule number 3. Don't sell gas to anyone driving a vehicle older than 1995. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't sell you fuel." "What do you mean, you can't sell me fuel?" "My money's good." "I'm sorry, it's a company policy." The driver's demeanor changed immediately. His friendly expression turned cold, and something about his eyes seemed wrong. They reflected the station's lights, like an animal's eyes caught in headlights. I've been driving this route for years. I always get fuel here. I'm sorry, I can't make exceptions. The driver stared at me for a long moment, then got back in his truck and drove away. As he left, I noticed his headlights seemed dimmer than they should be, and the sound of his engine faded much faster than it should have given the open terrain. When Frank called the next morning to check on me, I mentioned the incident. "You did exactly right," he said. "Don't ever serve anyone driving a pre-95 vehicle, no matter what story they give you." "Why? What's wrong with older cars?" "It's not the cars, Tommy. It's who drives them." On my fourth night, I discovered the importance of rule number 6. I was cleaning the coffee area around 1 o'clock when I accidentally switched off the radio. The sudden silence felt oppressive, like the building was holding its breath. Within minutes, I heard voices outside calling my name. "Tommy!" "Hey, Tommy, can you help us?" The voices sounded friendly, concerned, like travelers who needed assistance. But when I looked out the windows, I couldn't see anyone in the brightly lit area around the gas pumps. "Tommy, we're over here by the tree line. Our car broke down and we need help." I almost opened the door to look for them, but something made me hesitate. The voices sounded wrong somehow, too perfect, too synchronized, like they were coming from the same source. I quickly turned the radio back on, tuning it to static between stations like rule number 6 instructed. The voices stopped immediately. For the rest of the night, I kept the radio playing static, and I didn't hear the voices again. By my 5th night, I was starting to understand that Morrison's Gas and Go wasn't just a business. It was an outpost in hostile territory, and Frank's rules were the treaty that kept us safe. I'd also started noticing things about the forest that surrounded us. During quiet hours, when no customers were around and the only sounds were the hum of refrigerators and the crackle of radio static, the trees seemed to move and shift in my peripheral vision. But whenever I looked directly at the movement, everything was still. Sometimes I thought I saw lights moving deep in the forest, not the steady beam of vehicle headlights, but odd pulsing illumination that seemed to dance between the trees like will-o'-the-wisps. And sometimes, during the darkest hours before dawn, I heard sounds from the forest that didn't match any animal I knew. Not quite howling, not quite human voices, but something in between that made my skin crawl. When Frank arrived at 6 on my 7th morning, I was ready with questions. "Frank, what exactly is out there in those woods?" He poured himself coffee and looked toward the forest, which seemed harmless and ordinary in the morning light. Things that were here before the gas station. Things that were here before the highway. Things that don't much like people, but have learned to coexist with us as long as we follow certain agreements. What kind of agreements? The rules, Tommy. Every one of those rules represents a boundary, a line we don't cross. As long as we stay on our side of those lines, they stay on theirs. And if we cross the lines, Frank's expression grew dark. Then people disappear. And sometimes, worse things happen. As I headed to my apartment for sleep, I realized I was starting to adapt to life at Morrison's Gas and Go. The rules were becoming second nature, and I was developing the kind of hyper-awareness that let me notice things that didn't belong. But I also realized that Frank hadn't told me everything about this place, and I wasn't sure. I wanted to know what he was keeping to himself. My second week brought encounters that made me understand why Morrison's Gas and Go had such a hard time keeping night shift employees. It started on Monday with rule number 5. Around 1:30, a well-dressed woman in a rental car pulled up to the pumps. She looked normal enough, maybe 35, business attire, the kind of person you'd see at any corporate office. But something about her felt wrong from the moment she walked through the door. "Excuse me," she said with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm looking for directions to the old mining road. My GPS shows it should be around here somewhere." Rule number 5. If a customer asks for directions to the old mining road, say, "It doesn't exist." "I'm sorry, Mom, but there's no old mining road around here." Her smile faltered slightly. "Are you sure? My company sent me very specific coordinates. I have a meeting there tomorrow morning. I've lived here for 2 weeks and worked here every night. There's no mining road. I'll pay you $200 cash just to point me in the right direction." The offer was tempting. $200 was more than I made in most 5-hour shifts. But rule number 5 was clear, and Bob Wallace's warnings about following Frank's instructions exactly echoed in my mind. "Mom, I can't help you because the road doesn't exist." Her demeanor changed instantly. The polite business facade disappeared, replaced by something cold and predatory. Her eyes seemed to reflect the fluorescent lights like an animal's. And when she spoke, her voice had a different quality, deeper, more resonant. "You're making a mistake, Tommy Rivera." She knew my name, though I hadn't told her and wasn't wearing a name tag. She stared at me for a long moment with those reflecting eyes, then turned and walked back to her car. As she drove away, I noticed her headlights cast shadows that moved independently of her vehicle. Wednesday night brought my first encounter with rule number 9. Around 2 o'clock, an elderly man shuffled through the door carrying a small cloth bag. He looked harmless enough, maybe 70, wearing clean but outdated clothes, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints ached. "Pack of cigarettes and $20 of gas," he said, setting the cloth bag on the counter. I grabbed the cigarettes and started ringing up the sale. But when he opened his bag to pay, I saw coins that looked tarnished and old, really old. "Let me check the dates on those," I said, following rule number 9. The coins were all dated between 1965 and 1978, pre-1980, just like the rule specified. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't accept these coins." His friendly demeanor vanished, his face contorted with rage, and he started speaking rapidly in a language I didn't recognize, not Spanish or French or German, but something that sounded much older and harsher. As he spoke, the temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. The fluorescent lights flickered, and I heard scratching sounds coming from inside the walls. I backed toward the emergency supplies, remembering Frank's advice about trusting the rules even when they didn't make sense. The old man suddenly stopped speaking, gathered his coins, and walked out without another word. As soon as he left, the temperature returned to normal and the lights stopped flickering. Thursday night taught me about rule number 11 during a severe thunderstorm. The power went out around 1 o'clock, and I immediately started the backup generator as instructed. The station's lights came back on, but I noticed something odd. The secondary power box that Frank had mentioned was glowing. Not electrically glowing, physically glowing, with symbols or markings that seemed to pulse with their own light. The glow was hypnotic, and I found myself staring at it, wondering what would happen if I switched to secondary power instead of the generator. The symbols seemed to form patterns, almost like they were trying to communicate something. Part of me wanted to understand what they meant, to see what would happen if I just flipped that switch. But rule number 11 was clear. Use only the backup generator, never the secondary power box. I forced myself to look away and focus on other tasks until the storm passed and normal power was restored. When the lights came back on, the secondary power box was just a normal electrical panel again. Friday brought rule number 8 into play around 3 o'clock. I was restocking shelves when I noticed lights moving in the forest. Not the steady beam of vehicle headlights, but odd pulsing illumination that seemed to dance between the trees. The lights were beautiful in a hypnotic way, shifting colors from white to blue to green as they moved through the forest. They seemed to be approaching the station, getting brighter and more numerous. Rule number 8. If you see lights in the forest, close all blinds and wait inside. I quickly closed all the window blinds and waited behind the counter. Through the gaps in the blinds, I could see the lights getting closer and brighter until they were almost at the tree line. Then I heard tapping on the windows, not random tapping, rhythmic, purposeful, like something was using the lights to communicate in code. The tapping moved from window to window, circling the building, always accompanied by that beautiful, shifting illumination. I waited inside, with my heart pounding, until the lights finally faded and the tapping stopped. When I opened the blinds at dawn, there was no sign that anything had been there. Bob Wallace stopped for coffee Saturday morning and noticed I looked shaken. "You saw the forest lights, didn't you?" "How did you know?" "You've got that look. Same look every new employee gets after their first encounter with the lights." Bob stirred sugar into his coffee. "Thing is, they're beautiful, almost impossible not to watch. But people who watch too long start wanting to follow them into the forest. What happens to people who follow them? Some come back different. Some don't come back at all." Bob looked at me seriously. "Tommy, things in these woods don't follow normal rules. They're older than the highway, older than the towns, maybe older than the state. Frank's rules aren't just guidelines. They're survival instructions based on decades of experience." "Experience with what?" Bob glanced toward the forest, then back at me. "Things that hunt." By the end of my second week, I'd started having dreams about walking into the forest. In the dreams, I'd follow paths that seemed familiar, past abandoned mining equipment and old wooden structures, until I found an underground complex filled with people who'd been missing for decades. In the dreams, they were always waiting for me, smiling and waving, calling my name with voices that sounded like the ones I'd heard outside the station. When I woke up, I always found myself standing at my apartment window, looking toward the tree line, trying to remember what the people in my dreams had been trying to tell me. I was starting to understand why Morrison's Gas and Go had such trouble keeping night shift employees. and I was starting to wonder if I'd make it through my first month. My third week at Morrison's brought answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. It started when Frank arrived early on Monday evening, carrying a bottle of whiskey and wearing the expression of someone who decided it was time for difficult conversations. "Tommy, sit down. We need to talk." He poured 2 glasses and pushed one across the counter to me. "You've been here 2 weeks. You've followed the rules, handled the unusual situations, and proven you can do the job. Now you deserve to know what you're really dealing with." I sipped the whiskey and waited for him to continue. "This land used to be a mining camp in the 1940s, Frank began. Gold mining operation called Coldwater Extraction Company. About 200 workers lived here year-round, mining gold from shafts that went deep into the mountain." He gestured toward the forest that surrounded us. "The camp was successful for a few years, but then things started going wrong. Workers reported strange sounds coming from the deeper shafts. Equipment would be found moved or damaged overnight. Men started disappearing during their shifts, underground. What happened to them? Nobody knew. The company brought in investigators, security teams, even some military advisors. But the disappearances continued, and the workers started refusing to go into certain areas of the mine." Frank refilled his glass and stared out at the darkening forest. "In 1947, the entire camp was evacuated overnight. Official records say it was due to a gas leak that made the area unsafe. But the real reason was that something had been disturbed in those deep shafts, something that started hunting the workers." "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly. Local native tribes have stories about things that live deep underground, entities that don't like being disturbed. The mining company classified all their records and sealed the area, but they couldn't seal away what they'd awakened." I thought about the scratching sounds, the voices in the forest, the lights that seemed to communicate. And it's still out there. It's still out there. The mining company left behind equipment, structures, and pathways that lead to the old shaft entrances. Over the years, people have been drawn to explore the area. Some are just curious. Others seem to be called somehow. Frank opened a drawer behind the counter and pulled out a folder full of newspaper clippings and missing person reports. "I built this gas station in 1993 because the land was cheap. Took me about 3 months to figure out why." He showed me the clippings. "Danny Parker was my first night shift employee. Good kid, reliable worker. He lasted 3 weeks before he started ignoring the rules." One of the newspaper clippings showed a photo of a young man about my age standing next to a car. The headline read, "Local man missing after car found abandoned." Danny started asking customers about the old mining road, started taking walks in the forest during his breaks, started talking about voices that called to him at night. Frank's voice was heavy with regret. "I found his car at the forest edge with the door open and the engine running. Never found Danny." "How many employees have you lost?" 4, over 30 years. All of them ignored the rules eventually. All of them disappeared into the forest." Frank looked directly at me. "The rules aren't arbitrary, Tommy. They're boundaries that keep us safe from things that see humans as either threats or prey." He explained each rule in detail. "The old mining road really exists, but it leads to abandoned shafts where things wait for people to find them. Anyone asking for directions is either compromised or being used to draw others there. Pre-1980 coins came from the mining camp's company store. People who pay with them aren't entirely human anymore. They've been changed by whatever lives in those shafts. Vehicles older than 1995 are easier for the entities to influence or disable. They use compromised drivers to bring other people to the mining areas. The scratching sounds are the entities testing our defenses. The lights drive them back underground. The forest lights are a hunting technique. They mesmerize people and lead them into the woods. The radio static disrupts whatever frequency they use to influence human behavior. The secondary power box connects to old mining equipment underground. Using it sends a signal that brings the entities directly to the station. By the time Frank finished explaining, I understood why the job paid $35 an hour. "Why do you stay here?" I asked. "Why keep running the station?" "Because someone needs to. This is a major trucking route, and travelers need fuel and supplies. But more importantly, the station serves as a barrier. As long as we follow the rules and maintain our boundaries, the entities mostly stay in the forest. If this place was abandoned, they might start expanding their territory." Frank gathered the newspaper clippings and put them away. "Tommy, you've proven you can handle the job, but I need to know if you're planning to stay long-term or if this is just a summer adventure for you." I thought about my dreams of walking into the forest, about the hypnotic beauty of the moving lights, about the voices that called my name from the darkness. I think I need to know more before I decide. Fair enough, but remember, the entities are patient. They'll test you gradually, offer you things you want, make breaking the rules seem reasonable or necessary. Frank stood to leave. Just remember that every person who disappeared thought they were in control. They thought they could handle whatever was out there. And they were wrong? Frank looked toward the forest, where the first stars were becoming visible between the trees. They were wrong. As my third week progressed, I started noticing changes in myself. The constant hypervigilance was exhausting, but I was also developing senses I'd never had before. I could hear sounds from much farther away, distinguish between normal forest noises and the artificial sounds made by the entities. I could feel when they were nearby, like a pressure change in the air or a subtle shift in temperature. And I was starting to understand their patterns. When they were most active, what triggered their attention, how they tested the boundaries Frank had established. But I was also having more dreams about the forest, more moments of standing at my window looking toward the trees, more temptations to see what would happen if I bent just one of the rules. The entities were patient, just like Frank had said, and they were working on me. My fourth week at Morrison's brought the kind of night that makes you understand why some jobs have such high turnover rates. It started on Tuesday with a group of college students on a road trip from Seattle to Anchorage. 4 kids in a restored 1989 Camaro that had been painted cherry red and customized with racing stripes. They pulled up to the pumps around 2, laughing and playing music loud enough to hear through their closed windows. The driver was maybe 21, with the kind of confidence that came from never having encountered a situation he couldn't handle through charm or persistence. When he came inside to prepay for gas, he was already irritated. "Your pump's not working," he said. "We've been trying to get gas for 10 minutes. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't sell you fuel." "What do you mean you can't sell us fuel? We've got cash." Rule number 3. Don't sell gas to anyone driving a vehicle older than 1995. It's a company policy. I can't make exceptions. The kid's confidence wavered slightly. "Look, we're almost out of gas. The next station is like 50 miles away. We just need enough to get there. I'm sorry, I can't help you." His 3 friends had gotten out of the car and were approaching the building. They all had that same overconfident energy, but underneath it, I sensed something else. Desperation, maybe, or fear. "We'll pay double," the driver said. "Triple. We've got money." "Sir, I can't sell you gas regardless of what you pay." That's when I noticed their eyes. All 4 of them had that same reflective quality I'd seen in other problematic customers, and they were all watching me with an intensity that felt predatory. "Why won't you help us?" one of the girls asked, and her voice had the same synchronized quality I'd heard from other compromised people. I backed toward the emergency supplies, keeping my hand near the flare gun. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave." "We're not leaving without gas," the driver said, and his friendly demeanor disappeared completely. "Our car dies about a mile from here if we don't get fuel." Do you understand what that means? Through the windows, I could see lights moving in the forest around the station. Not vehicle headlights, but dancing, hypnotic illumination that meant the entities were active and nearby. "We can't walk 50 miles, another student said, "and we can't stay here overnight, so you're going to sell us gas, or you're going to deal with 4 dead college kids on your conscience." I was trying to figure out how to handle the situation when I heard the sound of air brakes outside. Bob Wallace's 18-wheeler pulled into the truck parking area, and I felt a wave of relief. Bob came through the door and immediately assessed the situation. 4 agitated college students, me standing near the emergency supplies, and the unmistakable tension of a confrontation in progress. "Evening, Tommy," he said calmly. "These folks having some kind of problem?" "They want gas, but they're driving a pre-95 vehicle," I explained. Bob looked at the students with the kind of expression reserved for people who'd made very poor life choices. "You kids need to get back in your car and drive away. Right now." "We can't," the driver said. "We're almost out of fuel." "Then you should have thought of that before you drove a compromised vehicle into this area." Bob walked over to the window and looked at their Camaro. "That car's been modified with non-standard parts. Engine's been altered. Someone's been working on it who knew exactly what they were doing." I looked more closely at the car and noticed things I'd missed before. The paint job wasn't just custom. It had symbols worked into the design that were hard to see unless you knew what to look for. The chrome had been replaced with something darker that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "The car's fine," one of the girls insisted. "We just need gas." "The car's bait," Bob said bluntly, "and you 4 are either part of the trap or you're about to become victims of it." Bob positioned his truck between the Camaro and the gas pumps, effectively blocking their access to fuel. The students became more agitated, but they couldn't argue with 18 wheels of steel. "You're making a mistake," the driver said, but his voice had changed. It was deeper now, with harmonics that didn't sound human. "We just want to get to Anchorage." "No, you don't," Bob replied. "You want to bring Tommy out to your car so he can see what's in your trunk. Or you want him to break the rules and give you fuel so your friends in the forest can track him. Either way, it's not happening." The students looked at each other with expressions of frustration and rage. For just a moment, I saw something else looking out through their eyes, something that definitely wasn't human. "Fine," the driver said. "We'll get gas somewhere else." They got back in their car and drove toward the forest road. I watched through the windows as they made it maybe half a mile before their engine started smoking. The car coasted to a stop just at the tree line, and all 4 students got out. But instead of trying to walk back to the station for help, they walked directly into the forest and disappeared between the trees. "Bob, shouldn't we help them?" "Tommy, those kids stopped being entirely human about an hour ago. Whatever's left of their original personalities is fighting a losing battle against something that's been hunting in these woods for decades." Bob poured himself coffee and checked his watch. "By dawn, their car will be gone too. It always is." "What happens to them? Best case scenario? They become recruiters, like the woman who asked about the mining road. They keep their basic appearance and some of their memories, but they serve the entities now." Bob's expression was grim. "Worst case? They become something else entirely." Around 4 o'clock, I heard voices outside calling for help. The same college students claiming they were lost and needed assistance. But when I looked out the windows, I couldn't see anyone in the brightly lit area around the gas pumps. Following rule number 1, I grabbed the emergency flare gun before even considering going outside. The voices became more urgent, more desperate, claiming they were injured and needed immediate help. "Tommy, please, we're hurt. We need help." But the voices were coming from different directions, like multiple groups of people were calling from various locations around the building, and they all sounded exactly the same. Not similar, but identical, like recordings being played from hidden speakers. I fired a flare toward the loudest group of voices. The moment the flare lit up the forest edge, inhuman shrieks echoed from multiple directions. The voices stopped calling my name, replaced by sounds that definitely didn't come from human throats. When dawn broke, I found the student's Camaro exactly where it had died the night before, but it was empty now, with all the doors standing open and personal belongings scattered around the vehicle, like the occupants had been pulled out in a hurry. Bob helped me report it as an abandoned vehicle, but we both knew no investigation would find any trace of the 4 college students. They made their choice when they drove that modified car into our territory, Bob said as we watched a tow truck haul the Camaro away. Same choice a lot of people make. They think they can handle whatever's out there. And they can't. Bob looked toward the forest, where morning sunlight was filtering through the trees and making everything look peaceful and normal. Nobody can, Tommy. That's why we have rules. Part 6. The Long Night. My 4th week culminated in the kind of night that makes you understand why Frank had gone through so many employees. It started with a severe thunderstorm that knocked out power to the entire region around 11 o'clock. I switched to the backup generator as instructed, But almost immediately, the secondary power box began glowing with those strange symbols I'd seen before. The symbols were brighter this time, pulsing in rhythm with the lightning strikes, and they seemed to be forming patterns that looked almost like language. The urge to switch to secondary power was overwhelming. The generator was loud and inefficient, while the secondary box promised clean, unlimited energy. But rule number 11 was clear, and Frank's warnings about employees who disappeared echoed in my mind. Around midnight, the 1992 pickup truck returned. Same vehicle, same driver, but this time, he wasn't alone. 3 passengers sat motionless in the cab, all wearing identical expressions of blank patience. The driver came inside and approached the counter with that same reflecting eye stare I'd seen before. "I need gas," he said, in a voice that sounded like multiple people speaking in unison. "I can't sell you fuel. We know you're here alone. We know the power is out. We know your backup systems are limited." His head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Sell us gas, and we'll leave you alone." "I'm sorry, I can't do that." The 3 passengers got out of the truck and began walking around the building, testing doors and windows. They moved with perfect coordination, like parts of the same organism. Then more vehicles arrived, cars and trucks from different decades, all older than 1995, all carrying passengers with that same blank, synchronized expression. They surrounded the station and began a methodical examination of every possible entry point. I grabbed the emergency supplies and tried to call Frank, but the phone lines were down. The radio was working, but only static came through no matter which station I tried. Around 1 o'clock, people started arriving on foot. They emerged from the forest in groups of 3 or 4, all carrying bags of pre-1980 coins, all demanding service with identical phrases and inflections. "We need gas. We need supplies. We need you to help us." But their eyes all reflected the station's lights, and their voices all had that same unnatural harmonic quality. I barricaded myself behind the counter with the flare gun and emergency flares, following Bob's advice about trusting the rules even when everything seemed hopeless. That's when Frank arrived. His pickup truck came roaring into the parking area around 2, emergency lights flashing, carrying equipment I'd never seen before. He was armed with flares, high-powered flashlights, and what looked like some kind of sound device. "Tommy, stay inside and keep following the rules." Frank began systematically driving back the compromised people with flares and bright lights. The entities retreated toward the forest, but they didn't leave. They formed a perimeter just outside the effective range of our defenses and waited. Frank came inside, carrying his equipment and looking older than I'd ever seen him. "They're coordinating a major recruitment effort," he explained. "Weather conditions like this make them more active and aggressive. They're trying to force you to break multiple rules simultaneously." Recruitment for what? For whatever they're building in those old mine shafts. Every few years, they need fresh people to add to their collective. Frank checked the charge on his flashlights. The good news is, this kind of mass mobilization only happens during specific weather patterns. If we can hold out until dawn, they'll retreat for another few months. But holding out wasn't easy. The compromised people and entities worked together with terrifying efficiency. Some banged on the roof to trigger rule number 2. forcing us to keep the exterior lights burning and draining our generator fuel. Others tried to lure us outside with increasingly desperate pleas for help. A few even tried to cut power to the building to force us to use the secondary box. Around 3 o'clock, the secondary power box began glowing so brightly it was visible through the storage room door. The symbols were forming complex patterns now, and I could swear I heard voices coming from the electrical panel. Not the usual forest voices, but something deeper and older, speaking in languages that predated human speech. "Don't look at it," Frank warned. "Don't try to understand what it's saying. That's how they get inside your head." But the temptation was incredible. The voices seemed to be offering explanations for everything: the history of the mining camp, the nature of the entities, the reason for all the disappearances. All I had to do was walk over to that panel and flip one switch. Frank grabbed my arm. "Tommy, look at me. Not at the box, at me. Those aren't answers they're offering. They're hooks. The moment you try to understand what they're really saying, you become part of their collective consciousness." We spent the next 3 hours defending the station against increasingly creative attempts to force us into rule violations. The compromised people tried every psychological manipulation they could think of, from fake medical emergencies to claims that they were lost travelers who needed shelter from the storm. The hardest test came around 4:30, when a group of them began using the voices of people I knew: my parents, my college friends, my ex-girlfriend, calling for help and claiming they'd driven to Alaska to surprise me, but gotten lost in the storm. "Tommy, please, it's Mom. I'm scared and cold and I don't know where I am." The voice was perfect, exactly like my mother's, complete with the slight accent she'd never lost from growing up in El Paso. For a moment, I almost believed it was really her. But Frank reminded me that the entities could access memories and emotions, especially during prolonged contact. They were using my own thoughts and feelings against me. "That's not your mother, Tommy. Your mother is safe in Phoenix, probably asleep in her own bed." These things specialize in making people abandon logic in favor of emotional responses. At 5:30, just as the eastern horizon began showing the first hint of dawn, everything stopped. The compromised people retreated to their vehicles and drove away. The voices from the forest went silent. Even the secondary power box stopped glowing and returned to normal. Frank and I stood in the sudden quiet, listening to nothing but the sound of the generator and the distant rumble of thunder. "Is it over?" I asked. "For now." Frank began packing up his emergency equipment. "They'll retreat to the old mine areas and stay quiet for a while. But Tommy, this is what the job really involves. Not just following rules during normal nights, but maintaining those boundaries when they're tested to the breaking point." As dawn light filled the station, I realized something had changed in me during that long night. The constant fear and hypervigilance had been replaced by a different kind of awareness, the understanding that some places required constant vigilance, and that the price of failing that vigilance was worse than just losing a job. But I also realized I wasn't cut out for a lifetime of nights like that one. Frank seemed to read my thoughts. "You're thinking about leaving, aren't you?" "I'm thinking about finishing college, getting a degree, living somewhere with streetlights and neighbors and cell phone service." Frank nodded. "That's probably smart. This job isn't for everyone long term. Most people who can handle it are running from something, or they've got nowhere else to go. He looked around the station. But you've proven you can do the work, and you've earned the right to make that choice. Will you be okay finding another night shift employee? I'll find someone. I always do. Frank smiled for the first time since I'd known him. And thanks to you, I know the rules still work. Even when they're tested by the worst conditions, following them exactly keeps people safe. As I prepared for what I knew would be one of my final shifts at Morrison's Gas and Go, I understood that some experiences change you permanently. I'd never again take for granted the simple comfort of being surrounded by civilization. And I'd never again ignore warning signs that suggested a job paid too well for what it appeared to involve. I finished my summer at Morrison's Gas and Go with a new appreciation for normal life and enough money saved to complete my degree at Arizona State. Frank found a replacement for me, a local Alaskan named Pete, who understood the regional dangers and took the rules seriously. On my last night, the entities tested Pete's resolve with a minor incident involving scratching sounds and forest lights. He followed the rules perfectly, and I knew the station would be in good hands. Frank drove me to Anchorage for my flight back to Phoenix, and during the 4-hour drive, he told me more about the history of the area and the ongoing efforts to keep the entities contained in the old mining regions. Places like this exist all over Alaska, he said. Remote areas where industrial activity disturbed things that should have been left alone. Most of them are abandoned now, but a few still have people trying to maintain boundaries and keep the problems from spreading. Will it ever end? Frank looked at the vast wilderness stretching out on both sides of the highway. Hard to say. Alaska's a big place with a lot of dark corners. Best we can do is maintain the boundaries we've established, and I hope that's enough. Back in Phoenix, I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised my professors and friends. The contrast between my normal college life and my summer in Alaska was so extreme that sometimes I wondered if the whole experience had been an elaborate dream. But every few months, Frank would call to update me on station operations, and those conversations reminded me that Morrison's Gas and Go was still there, still serving travelers, still maintaining its careful balance with the entities in the forest. Pete's working out well, Frank told me during one call. Follows the rules exactly, doesn't ask too many questions, understands that some jobs require different skills than others. Any major incidents? Nothing he couldn't handle. Had a group of compromised people try to force rule violations last month, but he held firm. The entities are learning that we're not going to change our protocols just because they increase pressure. I graduated with a degree in business management and took a job with a Phoenix-based logistics company. Normal work, normal hours, normal problems that could be solved with spreadsheets and meetings, but I kept Frank's rules laminated in my desk drawer, partly as a reminder of the summer that changed my perspective on life, and partly because some lessons are too important to forget. The rules had been more than employee guidelines. They'd been a survival manual for coexisting with forces that most people never have to consider. They taught me that some situations require absolute precision and unwavering adherence to proven protocols. And they'd shown me that civilization is more fragile than most people realize. maintained by ordinary people doing extraordinary work in places where the normal rules don't apply. Years later, when friends ask about my summer in Alaska, I tell them it was an adventure that taught me to appreciate the comforts of city life. I don't mention the rules or the entities or the nights when following instructions exactly was the only thing standing between safety and something much worse. But sometimes, when I'm driving through remote areas or staying in small towns far from major cities, I find myself checking for signs that suggest a place might have its own version of Frank's rules. And when I see those signs, too bright security lighting, unusually specific policies, employees who seem hyper-vigilant about details that don't matter in normal places, I make sure to follow whatever instructions I'm given, no matter how arbitrary they might seem. Because some places have rules for very good reasons, and some jobs pay well because they're worth every penny.